Let me read to you a passage from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 9, verse 14 to 29. It's the Gospel for Monday of the 7th week of Ordinary Time. St. Mark writes, As Jesus came down from the mountain with Peter, James and John, and approached the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. Immediately on seeing him, the whole crowd was utterly amazed. They ran up to him and greeted him. He asked them, What are you arguing about with them? Someone from the crowd answered him, Teacher, I have brought to you my son possessed by a mute spirit. Wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they were unable to do so. He said to them in reply, O faithless generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I endure you? Bring him to me. They brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, the spirit immediately threw the boy into convulsions. As he fell to the ground, he began to roll around and foam at the mouth. Then he questioned his father. How long has this been happening to him? He replied, Since childhood. It has often thrown him into fire and into water to kill him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said to him, If you can, everything is possible to one who has faith. Then the boy's father cried out, I do believe. Help my unbelief. Jesus, on seeing a crowd rapidly gathering, rebuked the unclean spirit and said to it, Mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. Shouting and throwing the boy into convulsions, it came out. He became like a corpse, which caused many to say, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, raised him, and he stood up. When he entered the house, his disciples asked him in private, Why could we not drive the spirit out? He said to them, This kind can only come out through prayer. That's from Mark chapter 9, verse 14 to 29. Well, it presents before us Satan. Our gospel passage I've just read shows our Lord effortlessly expelling an evil spirit that had possession of a youth since childhood. It was a tough nut to crack, not for our Lord, but for his disciples, who had been quite unsuccessful in their attempts to exorcise it. This case was but one more in what was a normal feature of our Lord's public ministry, the driving out of demons. This in turn is one of the many differences between the Old and New Testaments, for in the Old Testament Satan is rarely mentioned, featuring notably in the book of Genesis chapter 3 and in the book of Job chapter 1 and chapter 2. Satan appears also in Zechariah chapter 3. Ritual exorcism is found in the book of Tobit, as dictated by the angel in Tobit chapter 6, and implemented by Tobias in the book of Tobit chapter 8. We do read in the first book of Samuel chapter 16 that, and I quote, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Just what this evil spirit in Saul amounted to is not clear. After all, it was from the Lord. And we read that whenever David played his lyre, the evil spirit departed from Saul, chapter 16. In any case, the proliferation of demon possession and of exorcisms during our Lord's public ministry far overshadowed anything of the kind in the Old Testament. one could understand how a person raised on reading the Old Testament alone might have little sense of the abiding reality of Satan as a threat to the spiritual life of the individual. But the fact is that a great number of Christians do not take Satan seriously either. The reasons for this vary, but one reason is surely that they do not see or feel or hear Satan. Well, what can help in this regard is to read of the occasional dramatic attacks by Satan on the close friends of God in history, which God at times in history permits for his glory. Take but one instance. We read of extraordinary demonic interventions in St. Athanasius's Life of Antony, who lived from 251 to 356 AD. He was the great and holy desert monk of Egypt. Athanasius writes that when people would visit St. Antony at his desert home, I quote, they heard tumults, many voices, and as it were the clash of arms. At night they saw the mountain become full of wild beasts, and him also fighting as though against visible beings and praying against them. In one story, St. Antony decided to spend a night alone in a large tomb. A huge group of demons descended upon him and attacked his body. The devil, I quote, so cut him with stripes that he lay on the ground speechless from the excessive pain. The next day, Athanasius continues in his life of Antony. A friend bringing Antony supplies found him and brought him back to the nearby village. That evening he regained consciousness and asked for the friend to carry him back to the tomb. After his friend did so, St. Antony called out, "Here am I, Antony. I flee not from your stripes, for even if you inflict more, nothing can separate me from the love of Christ." Well, the demons returned, and this is how St. Athanasius describes what happened next. In the night they made such a din that the whole of that place seemed to be shaken by an earthquake, and the demons, as if breaking the four walls of the dwelling, seemed to enter through them, coming in the likeness of beasts and creeping things. And the place was on a sudden filled with the forms of lions, bears, leopards, bulls, serpents, asps, scorpions, and wolves, and each of them was moving according to his nature. The lion was roaring, wishing to attack, the bull seeming to toss with its horns, the serpent writhing but unable to approach, and the wolf as it rushed on was restrained. Altogether, the noises of the apparitions, with their angry ragings, were dreadful. Though he was in terrible pain, he responded boldly to the demons. He said, "If there had been any power in you, it would have sufficed had one of you come. But since the Lord has made you weak, you attempt to terrify me by numbers. And a proof of your weakness is that you take the shape of brute beasts. If you are able and have received power against me, delay not to attack. But if you are unable, why trouble me in vain? For faith in our Lord is a seal and a wall of safety to us." Suddenly, the roof opened up and a bright light filled the tomb. The demons vanished and his pain ceased. Realizing that God had saved him, Antony prayed, "Where were you? Why did you not appear at the beginning to make my pains to cease?" And God replied to him, "Antony, I was here, but I waited to see you fight. Since you have endured and have not been beaten, I will ever be a help to you and will make your name known everywhere." St. Athanasius writes, and I've been quoting from his Life of Antony, writes that, and I quote, "Having heard this, Antony arose and prayed and received such strength that he perceived that he had more power in his body than formerly, and he was then about 35 years old. Actually, St. Anthony lived to over the age of 100. Now, of course, this sort of occurrence does not happen much in the history of the church, but reading of it does reinforce our conviction of the very reality of Satan. And these days, we can tend to think that Satan is unreal. A narrative such as this, vouched for by the great St. Athanasius himself, also shows that God is ever the Lord. He is overwhelmingly the stronger one. This is very scriptural and obvious in the Gospels, where nothing seen or unseen can match the power of Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, there is another prince operating in this world, and he is behind the scenes. Our Lord calls him the prince of this world. And as our Lord's passion approached, he said that the prince of this world was coming. He was approaching with his forces, and he intended to destroy the Holy One and to nullify his influence. But this was to no avail, just as it had been to no avail during our Lord's public ministry, such as at the event of our Gospel that I read earlier from Mark chapter 9, verse 14 to 29. St. John Vianney was tormented by a demon for many years and gave him a nickname. St. Teresa of Avila and Padre Pio, among many others, knew the devil well. There are two extremes to be avoided in this matter: fearful obsession with the devil and ignoring the fact that we live on a battlefield with Satan and his forces drawn up against us. The letter to the Ephesians puts it this way: we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. There are two standards, and the standard of Christ is already victorious. Let us take our stand with him. As St. John writes, this is the victory over the world. This is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. That's the first letter of St. John, chapter 5,